Stop wasting the court's time. He doesn't have a lawyer. Let's move on. That's what the prosecutor sneered as the elderly man was brought into the courtroom, shackled, hunched over, his shirt still marked with dried blood. He said nothing, didn't argue, just took his seat at the defense table, alone. Then the courtroom doors opened, and in walked a man in full military dress, boots striking the floor with precision, medals gleaming. He didn't acknowledge the judge or the audience. He sat down next to the old man and addressed him quietly. "Sir, if you believe honor doesn't age, speak now. Stand with dignity." That old man was Franklin Pierce, 76, once a commanding officer of an elite airborne unit overseas. 3 decades ago, his name was attached to classified missions and commendations. Today it was listed on a court docket for charges of obstruction and resisting arrest. His crime? Stepping in to protect a homeless woman from a belligerent security guard outside a shelter. The news didn't mention his Bronze Star. They didn't talk about his decades spent mentoring young soldiers after Vietnam. They didn't show the sleepless nights haunted by war or the shrapnel still embedded in his leg. They only aired a mugshot, his face bruised, blood trailing from a cut at his temple. Headline: Homeless man confronts officers at women's shelter. Reality: Franklin had intervened when a security guard began yelling at a terrified woman with PTSD, ordering her to leave for breaking curfew. Seeing the fear in her eyes, a look he knew well from war zones, he calmly stepped between them. He didn't act aggressively. Instead, he extended a hand and spoke gently, using de-escalation techniques he'd learned in the military. But when the police arrived, they didn't ask what had happened. They saw only an elderly man in ragged clothes, a guard accusing him of assault. They tased him without hesitation and hauled him into a patrol car when he collapsed. He pushed a guard and disobeyed commands. That was the story in the report. The officer noted Franklin hadn't denied it, but no one had bothered to ask why. Now 3 days later, Franklin sat alone in a courtroom. He had no family left to call and no lawyer by his side. His public defender had dropped the case just hours before, overworked, underpaid, and rushing off after mumbling something about accepting the plea deal. Across the room, the prosecutor looked self-assured, organized, and smug in his tailored suit. Franklin had been offered a 90-day sentence, though maybe he'd forgotten. The judge sighed, growing impatient. "Mr. Pierce, do you understand the charges against you? Do you have counsel?" Franklin didn't move. He stared at the flag above the judge's bench, the only thing in the room he still recognized, still believed in. "Mr. Pierce," the judge said again. Then the courtroom doors opened. Heads turned. A tall man in full military dress entered. Silver, oak leaves on his shoulders, a chest full of combat ribbons, and a calm, steady intensity in his eyes. Colonel Raymond Dunn, active duty, decorated and respected. Without asking for permission, he walked to the defense table, sat beside Franklin, straightened his uniform, and said just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You taught me everything, Sergeant Major. I haven't forgotten." The gallery erupted in murmurs. The judge paused mid-sentence, and for the first time, the prosecutor's confident smirk faded. "Colonel," the judge began, regaining her composure, "may I ask what you're doing in my courtroom?" "I'm here to stand beside the man who once saved my life," Colonel Dunn replied, his voice calm and unwavering. "He's not alone today, and he won't be again." The prosecutor sprang to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The colonel isn't a licensed attorney and cannot represent the defendant." "I'm not claiming to be his lawyer," Dunn clarified. "I'm here as a character witness and to offer moral support. I'll secure proper counsel shortly, but for now, I request permission to make a brief statement." The prosecutor objected again, rattling off rules, protocols, and the inappropriateness of such a late intervention. "Objection overruled," the judge said, surprising not just the room but herself. "Colonel Dunn may proceed. This court values truth as much as process." The colonel rose, posture straight, every inch a soldier. Then he began to speak, and the room fell into absolute silence. He described a classified mission from 1983, deep behind enemy lines. Their unit was cut off, extraction impossible, radios dead. Franklin Pierce had taken charge, leading 6 battered men through enemy territory. Wounded in the leg and shoulder, Pierce had carried a young private on his back for 11 miles through dense jungle. The colonel paused, his voice tight. "That private, it was me." Franklin kept his gaze low, fixed on the table, but his posture shifted subtly, straighter now, steadier. Colonel Dunn pulled a leather folder from his case and laid out official documents. A letter from the department. of defense confirming Franklin's service, detailing his acts of valor and his decades spent mentoring young soldiers in the reserves. This court may see a criminal, the colonel said, his voice rising with tightly held emotion. But I see the man who shaped generations. A man who taught us more than tactics. He taught us integrity. He taught us how to survive not just the battlefield, but the world after it. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. The jury stirred, visibly shaken. Several shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge looked at Franklin again, this time truly seeing him. "Mr. Pierce," she asked quietly, "why didn't you tell anyone who you were when you were arrested?" Franklin spoke for the first time, voice gravelly with disuse but firm. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." Colonel Dunn shook his head. "It always matters." Then he turned to the prosecutor. "The police report is incomplete. No one reviewed the body cam footage. No one interviewed the woman he was protecting. This isn't justice," he said plainly. "It's convenience." The prosecutor grew defensive, rifling through his papers. "We acted on the evidence available." "There is more evidence," the colonel cut in. "And if anyone had looked beyond the appearance of a homeless veteran, you would have found it." The mood in the courtroom had shifted. What had begun as another routine case was now charged with awareness, unease, and awakening. A reporter in the back was already typing furiously. Near the exit, a police officer had removed his cap, recognition dawning across his face. "Your Honor," the colonel said, "I request a 48-hour continuance to secure legal counsel and gather the evidence that should have been reviewed days ago." The prosecutor began to protest, but the judge raised her hand to stop him. "Mr. Pierce," she said, leaning in, "is this true? Were you trying to protect someone?" Franklin nodded once. "She was having flashbacks. The guard was shouting. I just stepped between." The judge's expression softened, her eyes suddenly full of something more than authority. "And you didn't tell the officers?" "They didn't ask, Your Honor," Franklin replied simply. "They only saw what they expected," the colonel said quietly, resting a hand on Franklin's shoulder. "That's been his story since he came home. People see an old man. They don't see the hero beneath." The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, whatever his past, the law, the judge interrupted, exists to serve justice, not to hide behind technicalities." She turned to Dunn. "Colonel, you have 48 hours. I expect evidence, not just emotion, when we reconvene." The gavel struck. In the hush that followed, Franklin turned to the colonel. "You didn't have to do this, Ray." "You're right," Dunn replied, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "I didn't have to. I chose to. Just like you chose to carry me when you could have walked away." Message from Steelheart Stories. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe no hero should be forgotten, subscribe to Steelheart Stories. Help us honor those who gave more than we'll ever know. The judge ordered proceedings paused to verify the colonel's claims. Within the hour, confirmation poured in. Military databases, Veterans Affairs officials, even a brigadier general called the judge's chambers directly. Franklin Pierce had earned 3 commendations for valor, including a Bronze Star with a V device. He had trained over 2,000 recruits in leadership, ethics, and survival, and had done so without ever seeking recognition. His record at veterans outreach programs showed a clear history of diffusing conflict, not creating it. Colonel Dunn didn't waste a minute of the time he was given. He brought on a team of 3 attorneys with expertise in veterans affairs, secured the full security footage from the shelter, and tracked down the woman at the center of the incident, ready to ensure Franklin's story was finally told. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had transformed. The once empty gallery was now full. Veterans in uniform stood silently along the back wall, shoulder to shoulder at parade rest. Reporters filled the left side. Every other seat was taken by citizens, many of whom had never been in a courtroom before. The police report was scrutinized line by line. Then long overlooked body camera footage emerged, buried in the system, unreviewed until now. It showed Franklin stepping calmly between the woman and the guard. His arms were outstretched but non-threatening. His tone was steady, posture defensive, not aggressive. He intervened without violence, Colonel Dunn said clearly, standing beside Franklin, now dressed in a clean suit. He upheld the oath he took in 1966, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Under oath, the security guard admitted he'd shouted at the woman. Admitted Franklin hadn't struck him. He just kept saying, she's having a flashback. Give her space, the guard recalled sheepishly. I guess I might have overreacted when he wouldn't move. Then a woman stood in the gallery, nervous, her clothes worn. I'm the one he protected, she said softly. I was having a panic attack. The yelling and the lights, it brought everything back. He knew. He helped me breathe again. He didn't hurt anyone. He saved me. Her words sealed it. The courtroom fell quiet as the judge reviewed the files one last time. She removed her glasses, fixed her eyes on Franklin, and delivered her ruling. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. She paused. Sergeant Major Franklin Pierce, this court offers its sincere apologies for failing to see you and for failing to ask the right questions. Franklin blinked, his only visible reaction. I'm just glad someone still sees me. The colonel gave him a sharp salute. They do now, sir. Even the prosecutor approached him after the gavel fell. I was wrong, he said simply, offering his hand. I should have looked deeper. Franklin shook it without hesitation. We all miss things sometimes. Outside, cameras flashed. Franklin looked uneasy with the attention, but Colonel Dunn rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to speak to them, he said quietly. But Franklin adjusted his borrowed tie and stepped forward. I'm not a hero, he told the crowd of microphones. I just did what anyone would have done. The real story here isn't about me. It's about how easy it is to forget that people are more than what they seem. The colonel watched with pride. The man who had once taught him survival was now teaching a city compassion. Later that evening, at a modest gathering arranged by the colonel, the director of the shelter approached Franklin. We'd like you to train our staff in recognizing trauma and de-escalating situations. Would you consider it? For the first time that day, Franklin smiled fully. I'd be honored. From across the room, the colonel watched as Franklin animatedly explained techniques, hands moving with renewed energy. His voice was sure, his presence unmistakable. He's still teaching, said a young lieutenant beside the colonel. He never stopped, Dunn replied. The world just stopped listening. That night, the local news aired a new headline. Veteran on trial for helping, saved by his former student. And the next morning, a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse. They applauded as Franklin up eyed and they emerged, Colonel Dunn still at his side. One child stepped forward, clutching a small flag. My dad's a soldier too, he said. He says you're a legend. Franklin knelt, joints stiff but unbending. Tell your dad I just did what we're all trained to do, he said gently. Look out for each other. That never expires. A few days later, Franklin received a city commendation for civic honor. But when he stood to accept it, he made it clear. It wasn't for him. It was for every veteran still waiting to be seen, still waiting to be heard. The shelter where he'd once been arrested moved swiftly to reform. Policies were overhauled. Staff underwent trauma-informed training. Within months, the facility was renamed Pierce House, a designated safe space for survivors of trauma, complete with specialized support and retrained security. The judge sent Franklin a personal letter. Thank you for reminding this courtroom that titles don't define a person. Actions do. And that justice means seeing clearly, not just following protocol. The city's police department began mandatory training in recognizing and responding to PTSD in both civilians and veterans. And the officer who had once arrested Franklin? He showed up to the first session, one co-taught by Franklin and Colonel Dunn. The colonel soon returned to his duties at the base, but every month he made time to visit Franklin, sometimes bringing cadets with him to meet the man who taught by standing, not shouting, who protected by understanding, not force. Franklin never sought praise or the spotlight. He still wore his weathered boots, still moved through the world with quiet humility. But when he passed by the courthouse now, officers nodded, not out of duty, but respect. Not because of a verdict, but because they had changed. The real victory wasn't in the dropped charges, it was in the quiet shift that followed. Within the shelter staff who now asked different questions, within police officers who looked more closely, within prosecutors who took second looks before assumptions. 6 months later, Franklin accepted a part-time role at the local veteran center. He was given a small office where he began counseling those battling the same invisible scars he carried. His calendar filled quickly. His sense of purpose returned. You saved more than my life that day in the jungle, Colonel Dunn said during a quiet afternoon visit. You saved my understanding of what strength really means. Franklin smiled and shook his head. We save each other, he replied. That's the only war worth winning. When asked about his sudden recognition after years of being overlooked, Franklin would always answer the same way. Being seen isn't important, he'd say. Seeing others is. And in a world too often blinded by assumption and speed, that lesson stood taller than any medal ever could. If you believe no good deed and no soldier should ever be forgotten, subscribe to Story Delivery Man.